Good evening. I'm Kate Viens, Director of Education here at the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation in Waltham. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for our program Entangled Lives, Women's Labor from the Rural Farm to the Factory Village. This year in our Mill Talks lecture series, we've explored a range of topics that relate to our historic site, the 1814 Boston Manufacturing Company, the birthplace of the American Industrial Revolution. We've learned about the Boston Associates, the urban investors who developed the site, about Isaac Markham and the mechanics who designed the machinery here, and the lived experience of the mill girls, including the risks of working in the mills. This evening, we're going to expand our focus to learn about the variety of women's work in the early 19th century. Our guest this evening is Marla Miller, Distinguished Professor of History at UMass Amherst, who directed the Public History program from 2002 to 2021. A historian of women and work before industrialization, she is the author of The Needle's Eye, Women and Work in the Age of Revolution, and Betsy Ross and the Making of America. Her most recent book is Entangled Lives, Labor and Livelihood on a Massachusetts Landscape, published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2019. Marla, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's our pleasure. Well, I'd like to talk with you about your project to begin and how you discovered the Porter Phelps Huntington House Museum in Hadley, Massachusetts, and how you became interested in your project.
Oh, thanks for asking me that. I never get tired of thinking about the journey that I've been on. So it actually goes back to my undergraduate years. I was out at the University of Wisconsin and came to historic Deerfield to do the summer fellowship program, which is a 10-week residential program where students can explore their interest in early American history and think about what career they might want to pursue. Mm-hmm. And part of the curriculum is a research paper. And so I had chosen as my topic the distinct roles of ministers' wives in early America. Mm-hmm. And one of the sources I consulted was the diary of a woman named Rebecca Dickinson. Mm-hmm. And she had been friendly with the minister's family, and I was really just looking for references to the minister's wife in there. But when the summer concluded, the director of academic programs, Kevin Sweeney, who went on to be a professor at Amherst College, asked me if I thought the Dickinson Diary could stand a little more scrutiny. And I thought, you know, if no one else has looked at that, I'd like to be the first. And so I started researching that, and the diary, it's a very, very powerful document about what it's like to be an unmarried woman in early America. Mm-hmm. And so I needed to understand how she was supporting herself without access to a husband's income. And the diary told me that she was a gown maker. And Kevin Sweeney said, you know, there's a diary of a woman named Elizabeth Porter Phelps. And she lived almost directly across the Connecticut River from Rebecca Dickinson, like you might check to see if Dickinson shows up. Mm-hmm. And I looked at the diary, and sure enough, Rebecca Dickinson was there alongside, you know, some 60 working women over the 60 years that diary was kept. Glimpses into the lives of domestic servants, midwives, weavers, just this whole panoply of laboring women that kind of comes to life in that diary. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I've been smitten ever since. I never could shake those voices. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so you learned about the women who lived in the Porter Phelps Huntington mansion and the amazing circle of women. I think in your book you say more than 60 women circulated throughout that household.
Yeah, it reminds us of, you know, the great diversity of women's work in this period. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I wrote about early on is how, you know, popular historical imagination, when you think about rural women in early New England, mm-hmm. tends to focus on activities like churning and spinning, and, you know, this is the kind of thing mm-hmm. that if you know, talk to most people about what women's work looked like at the time, you know, that's the kind of thing we're used to visualizing. And there's a sense that women's work in that period was sort of homogeneous, that mm-hmm. all families had to do the same tasks, and that the work of the woman of the house was the same in all of these households. And one of the things that the extraordinary record of the Porter Phelps Huntington family shows us is the great diversity of roles that women played, even in a town like Hadley, which was, you know, it's small now, it was smaller then, and yet there's this whole range of ways that women could gain a livelihood. And that's revealed in Elizabeth Porter Phelps's diary. The family, you know, they were savers, thank goodness. And so there's a very, very large archival collection with legal records and financial records and correspondence between Elizabeth and her daughter. And then, of course, the house itself stands and is a historic house museum today in Hadley. And so I've spent a lot of time in those spaces, too, and thinking about what that might tell us about women's lives, because of course these working women didn't leave a lot of records themselves. You know, even had they generated those records in the late 18th and early 19th century, the odds of them being kept in the kinds of repositories that save our history today are slimmer than people like Elizabeth Porter Phelps. And so you've got to get a little creative when you're trying to, you know, find what they weren't trying to tell us in addition to what they were.
And I do just want to, before we go too much farther, I just do want to establish the types of women's work that you discuss in the book. So you discuss domestic service and
hospitality trades. So I should say, so, you know, Rebecca Dickinson started me on this path, and she was a gown maker. And so my early work is all about women in the clothing trades. And they're very much present in these sources. But in Entangled Lives, I wanted to look at some other areas of opportunity for women. And so I looked at domestic service. I looked at cloth production, which wasn't something. Cloth production and clothing production are very, very different, but are often conflated. And so I wanted to treat cloth production in this project. And then I looked at women in healthcare and healing, and also what I called hospitality trades, tavern keeping, boarding house keeping, that sort of thing. So those are the occupations that I looked at. But I'll say, you know, all of us as scholars are evolving all the time. And earlier in my career, when I was interested in occupation, Needle's Eye is organized that way too. There's a chapter on tailors, gown makers, seamstresses, and there's been a lot of really exciting work coming out of scholars in Europe. And one of the things I've learned from them, and this is why Livelihood is in the title of the book, is that in this era that we're talking about, people are really trying to sustain themselves day to day, season to season, year to year. And they do that in many, many ways that might change over the course of a day or a week or, again, season to season, year to year. And so I am thinking a lot less about occupation and occupational identity now than I was earlier on. I think that I think we overdraw that. You know, today in our society, when you meet someone, you know, the first thing you say is, what do you do? You know, and we all think of ourselves, well, I shouldn't generalize, but we tend in our culture to identify by our occupation. And so we project that on the people of the past. But I don't think that is as much, you know, so in the late 18th and early 19th century. So I'm trying, even though I write and talk that way all the time, I am trying to remind myself that people in the past, you know, did what they could do when they could do it to gather a livelihood for their family.
And I think that that people sometimes think in more simple terms about the mill girls at our site as well.
Sure.
It almost seems as though Waltham could not have been more different from Hadley in that this was a planned community. When Francis Cabot Lowell and Nathan Appleton traveled to Britain to investigate water-powered weaving technology, which was cutting-edge technology at the time, they visited the mill cities like Manchester and were dismayed to see the poverty and the pollution in those, and the squalor in those communities. And they were determined that when they established a domestic American textile industry, they were not going to replicate those living conditions. And so they were intrigued by experiments in Britain at places such as New Lanark, which is a World Heritage Site now, where there were experiments in creating model communities, and they brought that back here to Waltham. And so their intent was to build this, extensive integrated cotton manufactory. We saw the 1814 mill as we drove onto the site here, and to recruit young farm women from throughout New England, whom they understood to have a good work ethic and to be morally upright young ladies. And they planned to provide a dormitory housing for them with modestly priced room and board to pay them a fair wage, and to provide them with libraries and educational opportunities, and really, as I say, create this model factory town. And the experience for women here must have been exhilarating and liberating, that they were leaving their homes and they were coming to a community where they were with other women and they were learning new skills and they were earning money, which they could either send home or save. And many of them did actually save a good portion of their income, either for a dowry or for their education. But at the same time that the experience was liberating, it was also a living arrangement in which they were intensely supervised by the matrons in the dormitories, by the overseers at the mill. Could we talk a little bit about the women of Hadley and how their various occupations gave them new opportunities and encouraged their freedom of choice?
Yeah, supervision is a really interesting way into a lot of these questions, I think. One of the things that we see in Hadley, and this is especially true in domestic servants, and I should say, I should back up a little bit and say the Porter Phelps Huntington House was established as a household in 1752, and that enslavement was built into the house even at that time. Moses Porter and his wife Elizabeth Pitkin Porter enslaved 2 people at that time. Just if we're thinking about supervision, I feel like we should begin with those stories. And that the workforce in the house was a mix of African American, Native American, and English laborers. And the place that we see, I guess, so there's obviously going to be a lot of supervision involved and a closeness there, but one of the things that we see over time in the household is an effort to deploy the architecture of the house in ways that are intended to protect the privacy of the family that owns the house, but at the same time make it increasingly difficult for them to supervise their workforce. And so it winds up being kind of a two-edged sword. And I feel like I like to remind people that, again, and this is to think about the diversity of experience, that what was opportunity for one person might create constraint for another, and vice versa. And so when the family begins, like each generation expands the house, they make it larger, and the service areas of the house retreat to the back of the house, which allows them to create more formal spaces at the front of the house, and to control the movement of people through those spaces. And as a result, they feel that they can't supervise their workforce the way they want to, and things go on in the lives of their workforce that they don't really approve of, but also understand that they can't really control. And so that is definitely an evolving story in this period that I think is really meaningful, because I think, like, when we connect what's happening in Hadley to what's happening here in Waltham, young women in Hadley over time don't want to live in the home of their employer, like under any circumstances if they can avoid it. And so opportunities like, working in mills and many of the other opportunities that come to young women as a result of industrialization in the 19th century empowers them to change their circumstances, which in turn creates a little more negotiating power for the women who are willing to work as domestic servants, because families like the Phelpses are, in the correspondence you see them in a real panic about obtaining the help that they need to keep the house running. So it's all entangled.
And there were women, I believe, who lived at the house who had children with them?
Yeah, that's one of the most fascinating stories to me, is I hadn't really noticed that. I think, just for people in the audience who are researchers, I'm fascinated by the ways our research questions change as we grow older. And so like things that I didn't notice as an undergrad about these documents, I noticed later. And so one of them is motherhood. And so we see women who work for the Porter Phelps Huntington family, who have children in the workplace, and have to figure out how they will balance parenting and motherhood. And some of the women decide to have their children with them in their workplace, but others don't. There's a woman who worked for the family named Polly Randall, who had a little boy and an elderly aunt, and they lived in a town nearby, not far, but she wouldn't live or couldn't live with them. And she made the choice to ask her aunt to raise her son so that she could move to Hadley and work at the Porter Phelps Huntington house. And she would go home from time to time when she could, and of course her wages helped make all of that possible. But she decided that she couldn't have her child with her and earn the living she needed to earn. There's another story in the house that I find very compelling. There's a domestic servant whose name is Persis Morse, and they really love Persis. She's worked out well. She gets along with the family. She gets along with the kids, and in one of these liaisons with one of the hired men, the correspondence on this, they sort of think something's going on, and then they talk about a suspicion being confirmed. And in fact, it turns out that Persis is expecting. And this is a difficult moment for the family because it undermines their gentility. It looks like they can't control their help. Like, it doesn't reflect well on the household to have one of their servants pregnant. But they don't know what to do. And there's a great line from the correspondence that I would love to read if you think that would be appropriate. I marked it just because it's just one of my favorite passages from the letters. So Charles and Elizabeth are deliberating over, what they'll do. And Elizabeth writes her daughter, "Persis does not seem to have any inclination to quit here. Says she can do as much work as last summer. Says work does her no hurt. Indeed, she is as good as ever for aught I see. Yesterday she did all of the washing and all the work in that part of the house, cleared out that buttery, which is a great job, scoured it, replaced all the things, washed the floor, done all, and sat down to knitting before 4. I never expect to have another girl so kind and willing to wait on me, and yet I know some things are very disagreeable. Your father and I talk and talk about it and leave it just where we begun."
Wow.
And I love that, leave it just where we begun. So they're deliberating. So Persis realizes she needs to make her case. And she reveals to them, by now she's about 8 months pregnant, that she has had a child in the workplace before. And she explains to them that before she came to their employ, she worked in a large tavern, she describes it, and she had a toddler. And she explained how the toddler would go around to the rooms and pick up all the candlesticks and bring them down for Persis to clean. And so she wants to convince Charles and Elizabeth that the child will not only not, keep her from doing her job, but might be an asset. And there's something, compelling to me about, that she has to make that case, that her toddler might be put to work. she succeeds in keeping her job, which is what she's trying to do, and so they decide to keep her on, and she lives there another couple of years. And then there's an entry, well, I mean, when the baby comes, there's an entry that's really powerful to me. Elizabeth records that Persis has had the child, but didn't call her. She finds out in the morning that the baby has come. And, you know, just to your point about surveillance and privacy, I imagine here's this young woman who's delivering and, you know, presumably calling women around her, but she doesn't involve her employer in that very intimate moment for reasons I think that we can all guess. I mean, maybe the baby simply came too quickly and it couldn't be done, but for whatever reason, though those two women lived in the same house, Elizabeth was not there for the birth of the baby. And so, you know, that's another example of this kind of constant negotiation, trying to secure your livelihood and do it in a way that your child can stay with you. And, you know, she's trying to work out her situation. Elizabeth's trying to work out her situation. And, you know, in the middle is the result.
I'm thinking, there's so much in those stories, and I was thinking back to, as you were talking about simply, this is not, this seems like an abrupt segue because the stories that you told are so moving and so powerful. I'm thinking back to the you're talking about the architecture of the house, and how they expanded the home and developed more privacy for themselves but less of an opportunity to be involved in their servants' lives. The mill site here is an interesting landscape to scrutinize as well, because the mill girls lived in dormitories that were just all aligned in a row, just within view of the mill, perfectly aligned architecturally. The young women knew where they were expected to be. They knew their place. Their lives were so closely controlled. We have a document from another textile mill that gives the mill hours. This was a mill in Holyoke a little bit later. The mill workers were at work at 5 o'clock in the morning and worked until 6:30 or 7 o'clock at night, with a half an hour break for breakfast at 7 and a half an hour break for lunch at noon. And so we're talking a 12 and a half or 13-hour day every day, and then a curfew by 10. And their lives were centered between that row of mill housing where the matron supervised them, and the entrance to the mill. And in her research, my colleague Amy Green talks about if the mill girls were late to work, they might get locked out, they might lose their wages. Then when they were on the shop floor, of course, we can analyze the ways in which they interacted with the machinery, were tied to the machinery to allow the machinery to operate. Their movements were following the movements of the machinery. They were under the supervision of overseers who not only monitored their work, but monitored their behavior, their personalities. And I learned something striking when I started here, which is that the front of the mill was considered to be the side of the mill that faced the river, which makes perfect sense because the developers, the urban investors, had been merchants. And so in the port cities, their warehouses and their offices were right there on the waterfront, and they were oriented toward the harbor and the world beyond. And so then, if that is the case, then the entrance that the mill girls used was the back door. And they came into the mill, and between their housing and their employment stood the mill, almost as a physical barrier to that wider world that the river and beyond represented. So it's, you know, we again, research that predates my tenure here at the museum and that my colleague Amy Green has developed, tells us that the machinist I mentioned earlier, Isaac Markham, remarks in a bit of his correspondence that while the Boston Associates were paying very well at the start of this wonderful experiment here in 1814, they did not raise wages for a number of years, and in fact, in 1821, because of economic conditions, forced a 15% pay cut on the workers, both men and women, and the women walked out. The women walked out. But that speaks to their, in a sense, a privileged position that they had as workers, that they felt that they could do this, that they were here to participate in this industrial experiment, this capitalist experiment, but they had homes that they could go to, and so different circumstances, different options.
It's interesting, though. I mean, that makes me think of so many things. One is all of the ways. I mean, as historians, we have to have some humility about all the things we don't know and won't ever know. And so it makes me think about, you described that built environment, and where were the places where people could exert a little autonomy, where people could, find the man that they want to connect with, there's some, around this corner was a place that we could have a little bit of privacy for a brief time, or in the housing, were they able to, create spaces that felt like it had some autonomy for them. Like, there's so much of that will be very hard for us to discover historically, but was all part of the picture. I gave a talk not that long ago and was asked about work stoppages and labor resistance in Hadley, in the rural setting of Hadley. And it made me think about a couple of things. And one, again, thinking about the enslaved population, in that context, we were talking more about that aspect of labor at the house. And we got talking about people who self-emancipate. And I got to point out that of the 3 enslaved adults at Porter Phelps that we know about, they all left. They all found ways to leave. One ran away. One negotiated, this woman, Peg, negotiated a joint sale with another man in Hadley to a third party in Vermont, because they wanted to marry, and that was the way she could make that happen, is to negotiate that transaction. And then a man named Caesar Phelps wound up leaving with the Continental Army, not in service, I think, but as a servant to an officer. So we see people taking action to leave that context. But one of the things that I was impressing on that audience is that the 100 ways that people exerted autonomy through the day in ways that we'll never, that aren't preserved archivally. We have to remember that there's a lot happening that we are probably never going to discover. So I think that's just thinking about your point about resistance calls that to mind. But also, in terms of this, the agency, it makes me think again about the negotiating power that gravitates toward women who are willing to be domestic servants when other women make the choice because they can. I mean, as you point out, this is an option that some people have, when they make the choice to take other kinds of work. And there's a really wonderful story about Elizabeth Whiting Phelps Huntington, so Elizabeth Porter Phelps's daughter, and they are in Connecticut, and they want to start taking in boarders. They need a little extra money. And she explains to her mother that they wouldn't even think of it, but there is a young woman in the community that they hear is an excellent domestic servant, a woman of color named Chloe. And so they have high hopes for this arrangement. Chloe has a 3-year-old. And they, they're kind of like, well, what are you going to do? We have to accommodate this woman and her child. And Chloe names her price. She says, like, this is what I'm going to need. And she stays about 2 weeks, and they just decide we just can't afford that. And so that relationship, terminates, and they find someone else. But it's interesting to see that kind of power devolve onto the women who are negotiating their own terms. And there's another passage in that correspondence where Elizabeth is just, desperate for help. And a woman, knocks on the door and says she's looking for work. And Elizabeth, describes the moment as like, I nearly just burst into tears. Like she just was so relieved to have anybody willing to come work for her in the home. And so there's a lot happening in this period.
Right, and the industrialization of rural Massachusetts as well. I've been talking about our site here at Waltham, which was developed right after the War of 1812. But my own research has been on rural Massachusetts and the industrialization of rural communities. And so, knowing that we were going to talk about Hadley this evening, I went back to my notes and did a little bit of digging into what I had discovered in Hampshire County, and found that as early as 1820 there were 3 cotton mills and 2 woolen mills in the county. There were 10 manufactories in the county. But the number a decade later is just astonishing, that there were 18 woolen factories in the county operating 98 looms, and there were 6 cotton factories operating 212 looms. So there were 300 textile looms in operation just in Hampshire County in 1831. And most mills were smaller, but Ware had 2 large cotton factories that together operated nearly 150 looms. 10 towns in the county had textile mills. When you can point to 10 textile mills, to 10 towns having textile mills, that really, I think, indicates a change in the landscape and those pressures on the ability to locate domestic servants that you were talking about.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me. I mean, this is kind of on a more meta level, but here we are in a museum talking about women's history, and out there we are trying to reinterpret all these stories. And it's interesting how that data, that story, that chapter in the life of Hampshire County is not known out there. And it's interesting to me how communities have a sense, like, obviously Hadley's very oriented toward agriculture. I believe Hadley has the highest amount of farmland and agricultural preservation in the state. That's the part of the town's history that is understood and recognized as part of the identity. But here's this moment where there was all this industry and we don't think about that as much as we should, or know about it as much as we should. And so,
thank you.
So I love that you brought that up, and it just reminds us that we often think we know stories, and then we find out we don't know at all. We don't know the half of it. So I'm going to take that data home and see if we can get that on the radar of people out there.
Oh, that's terrific. Yes. I'm just looking at our chat this evening, and we have some wonderful questions that are both about the content of the book and about the book itself. There's great excitement over the book. So one question, will the book ever be available on Audible?
Oh my goodness, what a good question. Oh my goodness. Well, I have not been asked. If anybody knows anybody on Audible, find me. That would be lovely. I would love to read it myself. I love telling these stories.
And then also, is there a paperback of the book out yet?
I do not think so. So I'm apologies. I should know the plan about that, but I don't off the top of my head. But
it sounds like a question for Johns Hopkins.
Exactly.
We'll put them on the spot.
Yep.
Persis, do you have a last name for
Morse.
Persis? Morse.
Yep.
And do you happen to know where she's buried?
No, she disappears from the story. I mean, this is what's heartbreaking for me about so many of these women, is that it's the blessing and the curse of those papers. They're so rich. You see everything through the point of view of Elizabeth Porter Phelps, really. And so if somebody is not in her mix, it's very hard to follow them after that. So no, I don't know. After Persis and Dolly left the house, I don't know what happened to them. I don't know what happened to a lot of the women that I get to glimpse them while they're at 40 acres, and then they move on, and I don't know.
One of the other women who left the household, and this connects with what I was with my bringing up the range of industrial activity in Hampshire County. Polly Randall, I think she braid straw or palm leaf after she left?
Yes, I believe that's right. There are a few, I have to confess, sometimes I forget, those details, but yes, I think it's Polly who left to braid straw hats. And there's another woman, Persis Leonard, who left to go spin in the mill. I mean, you see this happening. It's interesting. As I was preparing for tonight, I was reading over things and noticed that Persis Leonard left to go to the mills to spin in 1796. And in another part of the book, I notice that the last time that there's any reference to weaving happening in the house is also 1796.
Isn't that interesting?
And so you really kind of get this little, these two little facts, but this moment that things are really changing.
The sense of how things really are changing.
Yeah. But you see, there's in the example that you mentioned about the braiding, there's a passage in the correspondence where the family, is kind of harumphing about that. Like there's a phrase, and I don't want to guess at the quote, but there's a phrase where the family's like, I can't believe she would rather be in her house, which is not as nice as 40 acres, than live here in our house and be our servant. And of course she would rather be in her house, no matter what her house is, and control her income and when she works and have her child near her. But when she gives her notice, like they can't quite take that in, that would be her preference. And so you really see that that disconnect between what these working women are wanting and trying to do and what the family has understood young women to do and what they should be doing for labor.
There were so many new opportunities coming up for them, and also all, of course, all of these occupations, these changes in occupational opportunities were involved with shifting gender relations as well, because we were talking about here at Waltham, the workforce was primarily the mill girls, and this was called this system of recruiting farm women from around New England, young women, 16 to through early 20s or so, was known as the Waltham system. But in Rhode Island, where Samuel Slater established the spinning mill, it was a different labor system that became known as the Rhode Island system that was more family-based.
Oh, interesting.
And so, and when we look at the record of the mills out in Hampshire County, as I was telling you earlier, we see men, women, and children employed in those mills.
Yeah.
So women of various ages, and including mothers, may have been working in the mills out in Western Massachusetts or Central or Western Massachusetts.
I do see a little of that. Like when these, the earliest mills come to like Northampton, there are advertisements in the paper that are seeking families. And they even sort of sketch out like, this would be a great gig for, a mother and a father, and this is what they'll do. And then if there were boys to do X and girls to do Y, and we'll provide a cottage, it's there is evidence that they were thinking of recruiting family labor at that time. And you remind me to point out that Christopher Clark, in his brilliant roots of rural capitalism, which my book depends on mightily, points...
As does my work.
Yeah, everybody depends mightily on Chris Clark. He points out that in Hampshire County, you see fewer women traveling to places like Waltham and just making that choice to join these mill villages because farming remains viable for much longer.
Of course.
And so there's a constellation of occupations that women can have that make it easier for them to decide to stay home. And that his finding is that it's poorer towns, poorer counties that the girls come from to the mills because farming isn't as viable there.
I don't want to miss the opportunity to talk about the Porter Phelps Huntington House today and how women's lives are interpreted there.
Oh, thank you for asking that. It's a really exciting time. And I have to say I've had the great good fortune to be around for 2 exciting times in the history of interpretation there because the house was created as a historic house museum in the late 1940s by James Lincoln Huntington, who descended, and his grandfather was a prominent figure. And his aim in making the house a museum was really as a gesture about his grandfather and his family's role as he saw it as leaders in the culture and politics of the community. And so he was very focused on the decorative arts, the mansion house, and allowed the agricultural buildings to be torn down because they sort of seemed like fire hazards. They were fire hazards. They didn't seem like fire hazards. Things burned. And so he was concerned about that. He let the agricultural buildings go. And for folks who are familiar with it, the barn that the Hadley Farm Museum is in is the barn from 40 Acres because the founders of that museum came to him and said, we'd like to build a replica of your barn for our museum. And he said, you can have this
barn.
Not going to use it. And he built a very fashionable sunken garden there. And so in its origin stories, which as museum folks know, the origin of a museum is very decisive about where it will go. It was all about the family and their prominence, and really not at all about the farm. Not even, it was a 600-acre farm at its peak, and that even really wasn't his interest. And so that was the first generation of the site. And then in the late 70s, they got their first director, Susan Lisk, the first director from outside the family. And Susan really brought the house forward. And this was the moment that women's history had really gotten traction in the academy, and sites were beginning to see, that this should be prioritized. And the house is called the Porter Phelps Huntington House because of the 3 women. Elizabeth Porter Phelps gave that, or Elizabeth Pitkin Porter to her daughter, Elizabeth Porter Phelps, to her daughter, Elizabeth Huntington. And so it is a story of a house passing through women. And so starting in the early 90s, there was a big reinterpretation initiative. I was a graduate student at that time. I was part of that. Kathy Kelly was part of that. Laurel Ulrich was part of that. It was all a very exciting time. And so women's history has been sort of the center of gravity of interpretation there for a long time. And even then, we were aware of and interpreted the stories of the enslaved people at 40 Acres, which is 3, it was Peg and her daughter. She had 2 daughters, and then one of those daughters had a daughter. So there's 3 generations of enslaved women, Peg and her family, and then an enslaved man named Zeb, and another enslaved man named Caesar. And that has also been part of the interpretation for a long time. But then, as I've surfaced these stories about domestic servants, and there's a series of women who come through the house who are Native American domestic servants, and of course conventional wisdom would have us believe that Native people were gone from the Connecticut Valley by the late 18th century, which couldn't be further from the truth. Right. And so we saw this opportunity to really think about all of these lives that unfolded at the site. And so that's kind of our mantra now. We're very blessed to have funding from the NEH, from Mass Humanities, and from the National Park Service to do a series of projects that are all meant to surface these stories of labor. And then our aim is that rather than have the center of gravity be the homeowners and then think about also the people that work there, we really want folks to come and just encounter all the different kinds of lives that unfolded on this ground and explore them all sort of independently. So we are working hard at that, and stay tuned. When the museum opens this summer, we hope it'll be a whole new experience for people.
Thank you. And I liked that you did that in your book as well. I think your first chapter is about Elizabeth Porter Phelps and her view from the mansion. And then you turn it around for the reader, and you turn our gaze back to the mansion, which is just wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the view from the back street. You know, what does it mean to come, as you're saying, come to the back door?
Yes.
You know, we as museum goers are accustomed to coming to the front door, but what happens when you flip it and you enter from the back?
That's right. And these are stories that we're hoping to tell at our museum as well. We've been through an interpretive planning process, and one of the key takeaways that we hope people will receive from our revised interpretation is that industry and innovation and technological achievements are first and foremost about people and people making choices, and that anyone and everyone can and has participated in that process.
Yeah.
So these stories are just so incredibly important to tell.
Yeah, they have a lot to teach us today because we are wrestling with many similar issues, and so it's, you know, we have a lot to learn.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I think this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed this very much. Thank you.
And thank you all to our audience for the chat questions, and for being with us this evening. Our museum opens to the public on April 6th. We hope you'll come back or visit us for the first time and enjoy our exhibits and see all that we have to offer. And I hope that you will take a trip out to Hadley as well and visit the Porter Phelps Huntington House Museum. It's been such a pleasure, Marla. Thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Oh, thanks, Kate, for having me.
And have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.